Welcome back, everyone, to NextGen Talks, the Future of Policing video podcast series, hosted by the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is called Double Standard, NextGen's take on the law enforcement response to the Capitol riot. We will discuss what happened this year on January 6th. My name is Hannah Mitchell, and I'm your conversation co-host. I'm calling in from Louisville, Kentucky, where I'm a student at Bellarmine University with majors in criminal justice and minors in French sociology and African-American diaspora studies. As for our guest for today's conversation, we have one of Gen Z's best who does more than just the average person. So I'd like for her to introduce herself, a little of her background, and why it's important for her to be a voice for the Gen Z demographic. So Maya, may you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. I am Maya Urban. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I am from Queens, New York, but currently living in Brooklyn. And I recently just turned 25, which has been a life-changing experience in my head. I currently operate as the Chief People Officer at a purpose-driven marketing company called Juve, which essentially means I oversee all things people operations, which includes recruitment, retention, and company culture. On the side, I am running and co-hosting a podcast called Big Fish Sink or Swim for and by Black women, where we talk about all things taboo and all things that Black women are essentially going through when becoming an adult, in quotes, whatever that means. And when I'm not doing those two things, I'm probably eating a lot of carbs that I shouldn't be eating, commenting on different political issues via my Twitter, and also using social media on the side to help Black startup brands really solidify their brand affinity in the city. So those are some of the things that I do on my free time as well as my day-to-day job.
So thank you so much for your introduction. I'm glad we got to see a little bit into your personality too. So now we can jump right into the conversation. And I want to preface it by saying that we are going to leave out the presidential and partisan politics in this conversation. And we're just going to focus on the police response to the insurrection in the Capitol. So when everybody saw what happened on January 6, 2021, there was definitely a lot of response from the American public. And I know I myself had my own reactions, but I'd actually like to get a little bit into what was your reaction to it when you saw the events unfold at the Capitol?
That is a great question. So when this started happening, I actually was conducting an interview for a role at my company. And I actually had no idea what was happening because at the time I was doing back-to-back interviews. So I think at that time I was on the phone for a solid 3 hours, back-to-back, 3 hours straight. So had no idea what was going on at the Capitol. And then one of my supervisors, they were like, they're storming the Capitol. And I'm like, who's they? And what do you mean they're storming the Capitol? So initially, there definitely was a sense of shock because being 25, I have not seen that level of uprising being done for the highest position in the nation. So that was just automatically new to me. But after catching myself up on what was happening, watching the news, doing quick research on what was going on for the past couple of hours, I sort of sat back and I was like, am I shocked at what is happening in this country at this given time? Am I shocked at the response to for folks advocating that we don't tolerate certain things? And like, am I shocked at what's happening? Am I shocked that there wasn't really much of a response or much accountability to the uprising? The answer was no, but initially I was shocked. Initially I was like, okay, what is happening? And it was scary. And I'm sure for a lot of folks, especially for my friends that live in DC, it was extremely scary.
No, thank you for that. And I honestly had a similar experience. Like I was in the middle of class and my friend ran over and he was like, hey, they're storming the Capitol. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? And I was like, hey, let me turn my camera off real quick. And I turned my camera off. I was looking it up and I was like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. But at the same time, I was like, I'm not really surprised. Of just like, I kind of expected a little bit, but I was like, wow, like this is the response we're getting. And it's like, as someone who is constantly at the Black Lives Matter protests and like, we're met with like flashbangs and plastic shields and rubber bullets and tear gas and barricades and tanks. And I'm just like, and I see on the Capitol, like on the TV, and I see that they're like, they have a little bit less force, but they have like welcome arms and some people are taking selfies. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is what we're doing now. Like we're really being this obvious about our difference here. And so like, as someone who understands social impact, do you think it's fair to compare like the difference between the Black Lives Matter protests and what happened at the Capitol, especially the Black Lives Matter protests last summer? They definitely had a very negative response. Do you think it's fair to compare? Is it apples to apples? Why or why not?
Oh, it is absolutely fair to compare. And the reason why I say, even though I personally would argue whether storming the Capitol is actually a protest, it certainly was not a peaceful protest. I think that is absolutely fair to compare, because I think that folks often try to pin folks that are marching for Black folks and people of color that have lost their lives as riots or non-peaceful protests. And that's why we deserve the reaction that we get from law enforcement. Then we certainly should be expecting that same reaction from storming the Capitol. I mean, it was literally called storming the Capitol. It was like that. Those were the headlines that were flooding our timelines. I mean, Donald Trump using the words of that encourage folks to take this action is certainly something that we can compare, and then also expect law enforcement to have that same energy for lack of better words. I certainly think it's fair. What I think is unfair is comparing the foundation of these protests. I don't think that those are the same at all. I think that folks fighting for the lives of folks that were murdered is completely different than what was happening in January. But I do think that we can definitely expect law enforcement to have that reaction when a group of people are being violent. To, again, the most powerful position within the entire nation. I think that that's fair.
No, definitely. And I completely agree that it does need to be compared. These are two examples. Like, people today would be like, they're both fighting for their rights, but like you said, it's a different foundation. It's different that Black Lives Matter are actually fighting for equality and to be shown that we do deserve to live, but they were fighting for like tyranny, and I didn't even know. And I was just like, we definitely need to compare, but at the same time, let's not forget that it's not the same fight. It's not the same thing. And I think as someone who was like watching it, I was definitely kind of hoping for the same response that we were facing in the Black Lives Matter protests. And like, I'm definitely not an advocate for police brutality or police violence, but I do think we were expecting for them to react in the same way. And I definitely think that we can even look at the arrest rates. I saw that only 52 people were arrested at the Capitol, but at Black Lives Matter protests, hundreds are arrested at a time. So we can definitely see that there's a difference. And I think part of that has to do with race. And I honestly think most of it has to do with race. And we can't leave race out of the equation. But as a country who like doesn't like to acknowledge that race is an issue, do you think that we need to create a standard so that we do not see these differences in race?
Could you clarify? Do you mean standard with law enforcement? Do you mean standard within ourselves?
Standard of law enforcement response to so-called protests or riots, however they want to use their wording. Do we need a standard response that we know to expect from both sides of the spectrum?
I think that's a great question. I think that to some extent we do need a standard response. I think that when we are dealing with situations in which folks could potentially be harmful to themselves or other folks, there is a certain way that I believe law enforcement should be reacting. However, because the foundation of why these protests were taking place, I think that we also can't take a one-size-fits-all approach, especially because of the history that people of color have with law enforcement. There is a certain care and caution and cognizance that law enforcement should have when dealing with folks that have a violent and traumatic history with them. So I do think that to an extent, yes, there should be a standard of like we do not accept violence amongst y'all or amongst us against y'all, right? But because that there's this racist, violent history with people of color and law enforcement, there is definitely has to be a difference in how law enforcement engages with us versus engaging with non-people of color.
No, thank you for that. And I totally agree that that there is a difference. And because of the history of police brutality, especially towards people of color, we saw it in the 60s with their March to Selma and Bloody Sunday and like the use of batons and dogs. And we're still seeing that today. But I definitely think there needs to be a new, maybe not standard, but a new perspective on how they think that they can control or like deter the protests or keep it peaceful, which most times the Black Lives Matter protests usually are, but we're still seeing that response. So I definitely think it's something to be looked at and something to be discussed. But we also saw on that day that part of the reason for their lack of response was because a lot of the law enforcement was not on the same page. We saw that you had police who were taking pictures and directing people inside, like, hey, here you go, here's the door wide open, go up these stairs to the left. But then we also saw people who were actually trying to defend the Capitol. And as a result, some died. But even that, there was a difference in that. And then we also saw that the mayor did try to call in for the National Guard, but the call was ultimately denied by the Defense Department and the president. And so then it was just a question of whether who had jurisdiction over the Capitol, which law enforcement had it. And so it made it really kind of chaotic at the insurrection at the Capitol. So like, who do you believe is at fault for what happened? Who do we look to when we need to demand an answer, a solution? Who do you think is behind the scenes? Who is the one who should have done better?
I think that it's numerous people. I think it's a combination of things. You're absolutely right in that some of the law enforcement were not on the same page. I mean, when I was catching myself up on what was happening when it first started and I was unaware, I was reading that the Washington Post wrote an article saying that the Pentagon issued memos days prior to Trump's White House rally, restricting guardmen from interacting with protesters and accessing ammunition and riot gear and things that they would normally have for protests like Black Lives Matter or protests that are involving other people of color, and standing up for their rights and standing up for them to simply live. Because let's not forget that people of color are simply shot dead for existing. So in that instance, it's certainly the folks that are working for the administration that are at fault here. When you see police officers taking photos and directing people to specific Congress people's offices and allowing them to cause havoc, it is certainly the officer's fault. When you have Congress people like Derek Evans engaging in the actual riot, it is certainly a problem. I think that it's hard to pinpoint somebody specific because it is a systematic issue that has allowed us to think that these double standards and how law enforcement are handling protests or rioting, it's hard to pinpoint somebody specific. But I think that everybody can definitely be culpable of what happened on January 6th. Everybody that was working that building, whether you were a congressperson or whether you were law enforcement.
No, thank you for that. And I do agree that multiple people need to be held accountable for that. But also, like you said, that maybe think of something else is how the media portrayed it and how we saw days before that we saw this was going to happen, but it was supposed to be like a parade or March for Freedom. I don't remember what it's called, but
Rally to Save America.
Yeah, Rally to Save America. And the media was portraying it in some way as if it was patriotic and heroic, but when you see media for Black Lives Matter protests, they use words like rioters, but they were really scared to use that with what happened at the Capitol. We see media where some people do refer to it as terrorism. We see there's definitely a difference in media. So what do you think that the media response held in accountability and had as a reaction or help towards the reaction towards the public?
I think that the media response was definitely skewed. And I think that there wasn't enough follow-up media response after there have been indications that this was a pre-planned rally in quotes. And that there could have potentially been folks that were working inside the Capitol that knew about this beforehand. I don't think that there was enough follow-up media releasing this information afterwards. I mean, I was reading an article earlier that was saying that according to Signal Labs, storm the Capitol was used 100,000 times 30 days before it actually happened. This is a riot. this was not a protest. And the media portrayed it as if the media was scared to use those words. Even us saying storm the Capitol. Let's call a spade a spade. Let's call it domestic terrorism. Let's call it rioting, because that's what it is. And the media, and they have done this in the past, just does not keep the same standard for non-people of color versus people of color. And we saw that with media with Hurricane Katrina. I know that's a little bit in the past, but that was one thing that was very prominent for the Black community, is that there was a newspaper article of a Black person swimming in the water, and it said trying to steal food. But then there was an article of a white person, and it was looking for food, trying to find safety. These double standards within the media have existed, but specifically for this instance, I think that they could have done a better job with providing the public with the accurate facts of how this storming the Capitol actually took place and who was responsible for it. I think that required a lot more attention than it received.
No, definitely. And the fact that the media constantly changes its perspective on, I guess, wording you would use, like the difference between protest and rioter, or the difference between blaming someone, but then saying that this is their right, this is their duty for their like American freedom, for a free country that they want to live in. And it's like, there's definitely a large difference in the wording in the media. But also, as you said, there needs to be better follow-up. And with that, I think we need to look at solutions to what we can do better as a country, because not only does this make our country look bad on the inside, but I think from other countries' perspectives, I know we definitely look not good. And so what do you think is a solution that we can have to this insurrection and this riot at the Capitol?
Solution. Do you mean in terms of the double standards for law enforcement, or getting the word out there for media? Or
both?
So regarding media, I'll answer that first. I think we often, or at least I can speak for myself, I often underestimate the power of word to mouth. The amount of information that I have gotten from my community this summer regarding folks that needed justice, regarding folks that needed more resources to get that justice, for people like Breonna Taylor, for people like George Floyd, for people like Ahmaud Arbery. All of this information was not on the news until it was already like well known and widespread. That information was shared between communities, between folks that go to the same school, that are living in the same area. The power of social media, because I consider that word to mouth now, because it's the new day and age. The power of social media and just communicating is absolutely phenomenal. And I think that we could do a lot with just that. And we do a lot. A lot of young folks mobilize off of social media. They're not necessarily paying attention to the news, but they're getting their news from social media. So seeing these things and then deciding to take action based off of seeing it on social media does a lot, and it has done a lot for a lot of movements and for a lot of communities. In regards to law enforcement, I think what we can do is continue to do what we're already doing, that's calling it out. I think that although we know that we have a long way to go, like I know that we are far from where I would like to see law enforcement to be, I would say that we have made some strides, and that this is a public conversation that everybody is having. Prior to this year, Black Lives Matter was not something people wanted to say publicly. I remember saying that in school and explaining why it was okay to say it, and being met with, but it's led by terrorists. That group is violent. That group is domestic terrorism. And we're in the space today where folks feel more comfortable, whether it's right or wrong that it took so long. We are in a space today where folks do feel more comfortable standing up against a system, because that is scary. Like the police and law enforcement is a system. They are a system with a lot of power and a lot of money, and that can be scary to speak out against. Or sometimes folks feel like because they are a system, I am too small to feel like I have a voice. But again, I would say the power of word to mouth, the power of sharing resources on social media is absolutely phenomenal. And again, we are at a place that I never thought that we'd be 4 years ago. We're at a place where folks are openly talking about the inequalities and equities that are not just in the system overall, but specifically related to police brutality and law enforcement. So I would say continue to share those resources, continue to go out if you're able to protest. I know that we are in a pandemic and lots of folks don't have the ability to go out because we're in a pandemic or because they are around immunocompromised family members like myself. But continue to support in ways that you can, like donating if you can, like working in places that are providing folks who are on the ground food, sharing those resources. All of these things do matter and make a difference in the larger conversation of keeping law enforcement and police accountable.
No, thank you for that. And I definitely agree that social media has become a way powerful force than I think our parents or grandparents would have ever thought. As they always say, you're always on your phones, but we are on our phones, and I think we do need to continue to be on our phones because that is how we find things out. I know I myself have learned a lot on the social media website TikTok, where I've actually learned a lot more there than I have in my education system. And I think that it is because people are actually being able to use those resources and spread it by word of mouth, like you said. And so I think that's definitely one of the good solutions that we need to look at. And so as we come to closer to the end of our conversation, I wanted to get a little perspective. And so Y Pulse did this survey to report and analyze the Millennial and Gen Z perspective to what happened. And I'm just gonna write off some percentages that they found from the Gen Z's perspective and see if you agree with them or recommend anything. So the study showed that 68% of Gen Z and Millennial people saw what happened as violent, and 55% anti-American, and 54% Trump's fault. And then 4% said it was justified. And on the other hand, they also said that there was a 96% belief that there is no longer trust in the government, and 94% of Gen Z felt less safe, and 95% feel more anxious. So with those percentages, we are seeing that the Gen Z and Millennial community are being able to speak out about their perspectives on this. But when they're seeing this, they're thinking our country is more violent and it's making them anxious. And they definitely feel like it was an anti-American act. So as someone who is Gen Z and Millennial community, do you agree with what they found in the study? Do you think it portrays kind of your anxieties or feelings or perspectives of what happened? And what do you think that the Gen Z and Millennial community can do to help improve policing so that they do not feel this way, that they don't feel less safe, so that they don't feel more anxious in the country?
That is a great question. I'm trying to remember some of the numbers in my head, but I guess the numbers themselves are less important and more so the concepts. I would definitely agree with the statistic regarding feeling safe and not trusting the government. I think that as a first generation low income Black woman who's also queer, I have often felt let down, by the government or our system. So I wouldn't say that for me personally, the insurrection ignited that or enhanced it for me personally, but I would say that it provided another example as to why I don't feel safe in this country and as to why I don't trust the government. So I personally definitely relate to those statistics. I would potentially push back on the anti-American statistic. I mean, if we look at the history of some of the major events that happen in this country, it involves violence and stealing. I mean, that is just the foundation of what America was built on. And that is just a fact. So I don't know if it's necessarily anti-American. I almost want to say they're doing what America has embodied for them as acceptable behavior. And I think that we embodied it again by not holding these people accountable. So I personally don't necessarily agree with that statistic. I understand why people would say that. I think that we often want to believe that America is this place that folks have freedom. And again, we do have lots of freedom in this country, some freedoms that we wouldn't have in others, and that it is a blessing to be a part of this country. But I think that we also have to remember there are specific communities, underserved communities, that will feel like this is exactly another example of what's been happening to them their entire life. Somebody not looking out for them and the folks causing harm not being held accountable. So I personally wouldn't agree with that statistic, but in terms of feeling unsafe, in terms of not feeling like the government has my best interest in mind, I certainly agree with those.
Oh, thank you for that. And honestly, when I first read it, I didn't even think about what you said. So thank you so much for pointing out that the anti-American part, now that you said it, I definitely can look back and be like, that's definitely American. It's definitely what America has allowed. It's what it's emphasized, it's what it's promoted, and how it's been. It's how it's thrived, basically, based off that violence, based off that white supremacy that we do see in a lot of the institutions in this country. And so I definitely think that although we said anti-American, I think it's anti-American what people believe they want American values to be. That's how we can look at it, I think. So with that said, do you have any final thoughts or advice towards the Gen Z and Millennial community to take away from this discussion?
I think that my advice would be putting politics aside, because that can often be a murky area. I think we have to ask ourselves, is this right? Was this something that is okay to do? I think that comparing this to the way that law enforcement responds to Black Lives Matter is a fair comparison, to really look at the words that are used to describe the protesters fighting for people that have lost their lives and the words used for protesters that are upset with the results of an election. And I also think that we also have to analyze, again, the foundation of why folks are protesting. I think that politics aside, when you're really looking at them apples to apples, the answer is clear, whether there's a double standard or not. So I would just urge people to have these conversations like this and talk to folks that they wouldn't normally talk to, and get that perspective, because it is harmful. This is harmful for us because, as we know, people of color in poor communities are the communities that are heavily policed the most. So it's not like this event happened and it doesn't affect us at all. This event happened and it shapes how folks respond to future events like this within white communities. But we can't forget to have these conversations, as it's going to affect us the most. So that's what I would say to the folks wanting to engage in this conversation, is to really take a step back and analyze why this is important to have this conversation. Even though this happened in January, the effects that this can have is extremely harmful. And that's something that shouldn't be overlooked.
So thank you so much for that. I do believe that perspective, it is all about perspective, and people need to take a step back, look at these, compare it for themselves, and see that the truth is right there. It's right there in plain sight. It's obvious. And so I think you were able to point out a lot of what the Gen Z is feeling in this conversation. So thank you so much for your contribution. And Maya, you helped to break down the events of the insurrection and give the Gen Z perspective that I believe many people want to hear and see. So once again, this is NextGen Talks, the future of policing. Thank you all for watching, and we hope to see you next time.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, welcome to NextGen Talks, the Future of Policing, a video podcast series from the National Millennial and Gen Z community. I am Maya Jacobs, a graduate of Xavier University of Louisiana, and I currently work in marketing and PR. And we're here with our next episode, which is called Double Standard, NextGen's Take on Law Enforcement Response to the Capitol Riots. And I'm here with a fellow Gen Zer, Jamal Holtz.
Hello. Fellow Gen Z, it's weird to say that because I sometimes feel like I'm a millennial.
I am Gen Z. It was like millennials. And then I found out that we're like the older Gen Z people.
They just lump us all together, which is fine.
Yeah. And we're like the cutoff. Like Gen Z ends at like 23 right now. So it's
exactly.
We're the elders.
I'm fine with it though. Any years I can get being young, I'll take it.
Seriously, any street cred I can get. So as you guys will see, this podcast episode is going to be a little bit different. Mariah, do you want to do part 2 of like the second one?
Yeah, you can just say this is the second part of this conversation.
Okay, yeah, this is part 2 of our. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to get you like that, Jamal.
No, you're good.
All right. This is part 2 of our double standard conversation, and we think it's really important to capture Gen Z voice and capture Gen Z reactions, because if we're going to talk about the future of policing, we have to take in account our genuine feelings, but also our genuine solutions and plans and what we bring to the table. And that's why I have Jamal here. So before we get any further, Jamal, can you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Often the questions that I like answering, but also hate. But my name is Jamal Holtz. I'm a native Washingtonian. That means I was born and raised here in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Currently, I'm a lead organizer with the Stay Hood campaign called 51 for 51. It's a Stay Hood organization that focuses on making D.C. the 51st state, but through a specific plan, and that's bypassing the filibuster and passing D.C. with a simple majority in the Senate, and really breaking down those barriers in the Senate to really help us move forward and make progressive reform. In my professional work, I serve as a assistant to the president at a social impact firm called Link Strategic Partners. We do community-driven work across the globe and really helping our clients turn some of their challenges into solutions, and really helping build a real and thorough, authentic community engagement process for the work that they're doing in the community. So that's about me. Young, Black, progressive kid, really just fighting the fight and fighting on the most pressing civil rights issue of our lifetime.
Awesome. A loaded question with a loaded answer. We love it.
I'll shorten it next time.
Okay. No, it was perfect. It was awesome. So one of the things that I really wanted to add to this conversation is maybe a bit of a timeline, because I know you have some really awesome solutions that we'll get into later. But I think as Gen Zers and just in general with this like social media age of things, there's like, I know what happened, like, and there's the spirit of I know what happened, and then there are the receipts of I know what happened. And I think as Gen Zers, we like to have both of them. So that'll be a part of this conversation. But before we even get there, let's get into kind of like some of the meat of it. As you like to say, native Washingtonian, what was your real gut reaction to the Capitol riots on January 6th?
My real gut reaction to the Capitol riots on January 6th, it was a day like many other in our country's history. It was a day that started with Black joy and a day that ended with white hate. For many people here in Washington, D.C., we felt so much joy on January 6th. Why? Because Georgia elected their first African-American senator to serve the state of Georgia, and also elected John Ossoff as well. That day, we got 2 new Democratic senators in the U.S. Senate, and 2 senators that support D.C. statehood. And for us here in Washington, D.C., it was joy. It was finally Black people here in the nation's capital are going to be able to get access to representation and access to the full democracy and access to their rights, the full rights that they deserve. But like I said, the day ended with white hate. I woke up that morning and I was headed to the dentist's office. I was getting my braces off, as you see, or a follow-up. That's why I can never stop smiling. And I had my nephew with me. That day, as I was coming out of the garage, it was a bunch of Trump supporters that were rallying together to get into a few 15-passenger vans in my residential garage. And I had my nephew with me. And when we came back, it was like the town, and I'm a few blocks from the Capitol, here on 4th Street, and the area was pretty quiet, but I just kept hearing sirens after sirens. And I went back upstairs, and I'm relaxing, feed my nephew, and then put him on to school to do some schoolwork and drawings and stuff like that, 4-year-old. I turn the news on, and I literally see every news channel reporting insurrectionists, a mob of white supremacists, Trump supporters, literally bombarding the Capitol grounds. So being blocks away from that, I couldn't hear it, but I felt it. And it was emotional because I couldn't believe it was happening with my own eyes. And I was like, is this true right now? Is this literally what I'm seeing right now? Blocks away from my house. And to be frank, to keep watching it and scrolling through Twitter and see people that I know that were working in the Capitol at that time, Black staffers that I know that felt the hurt and pain, feeling like it was literally modern day slavery, modern day Jim Crow. It hurt me. It hit home, and I got teary. And my nephew, wonderful kid, lovely kid, and brings all the energy, was like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "Nothing." So I'm okay.
Right. We're not talking about this with the babies, like
right. And 4-year-old. But even if I am going to talk about it, there's no way I can put it in words for him to even understand. And that's what it felt like. It felt like a day where, like many other in our country's history, where we saw supremacy at its finest.
Wow. That's pretty powerful, especially being a non-Washingtonian, and being from down South Louisiana, and definitely being no stranger to white supremacy, racism, police brutality, any of the likes, but just seeing, and this wasn't even an issue of police brutality. I mean, I think as we've all gotten into it, we kind of brought it down to, police incompetency. And looking at the, title of this, we're saying double standard. So as Washingtonian, a huge inspiration for this project, and even the founding of our partner nonprofit, Engage Public Safety, was the BLM protests and demonstrations that happened across the world, but definitely in our nation's capital last summer. So can you kind of give us the, on the ground experience of that versus what you saw on January 6th?
Yeah. Well, Maya, did you see, and I'm sure you did you see all of the protests that were happening here in Washington, D.C., and how many people were getting arrested in Washington, D.C. in the summer?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess since I brought up the timeline, just to go into our timeline, and one of the things that was a part of the preparation for January 6th, and this is from Tuesday, January 5th, and we're talking about the mayor of DC, Mayor Bowser, was her concern off of what we saw in June of 2020 with law enforcement, federal and city levels response to BLM protesters as far as tear gassing, and literally just physically attacking protesters who were actually peaceful protesters at the time. So that's definitely something that was included in some of the sources that are going out as far as how did this happen. So yeah, for sure.
I'll be honest with you. I didn't partake in many protests downtown for one reason. It was for my safety. And it wasn't that I wasn't wasn't the fact that I wasn't willing to put my life on the line to fight for economic justice, racial justice, and all of those things. It was the fact that I knew, one, that the reality in our country is that police have not protected Black lives for a long time and still don't. And it was, two, the fact that I couldn't get my mom to even fathom the fact, the reality of me going downtown and peacefully protesting. I had a close friend. I have a close friend who spent his entire summer days every day, from morning to night, from sunrise to sundown, who quit his job and everything to literally commit his life to going downtown every day to protest, and every day risked his life. Every day risked opportunities from other employers who were reaching out like, "Hey, I want you to come on and work for me." But it was him going to jail often, him being written citations often, him being beat often, him being pepper sprayed often, and literally risking his life for democracy. There was one day in the summertime where literally over 230 protesters were arrested. Majority Black protesters were arrested for advocating for Black lives and racial justice and true equity. January 6th, my frustration truly came in that night, is when I'm looking at the news. We clearly see people breaking the law. We clearly see people doing things that they aren't supposed to be doing. And the day ends with 11 people being arrested, 16 people being arrested, versus 230 majority Black people being arrested in the summer for protesting peacefully. But not many people were arrested that night when the crime was actually in your face. So if that didn't show true racism and what it meant, how you're treated different based on this, you're not understanding reality here. I was so in so much urge and anger that night that I literally didn't know how else to channel my energy and anger, but either to tweet. And sometimes Twitter fingers don't always turn well. So I just went on to paper and just started typing how I felt, what it felt like. And another thing that was annoying that night was I kept seeing people going to the news to talk about what it felt like to be in Washington, what it meant to be in DC during that time. And the one thing that the news anchors were even getting wrong was that they just kept inviting back police chiefs and people who ran the Justice Department, people who were connected to law enforcement to talk about everything that was happening on January 6th. There was nobody on the news talking about how my grandmother couldn't get access to her home health aid that day because there were white supremacists in her town that blocked her home health aid from getting to her. Nobody talked about how the grocery store downstairs or across the district was closing and families were sacrificing their lives that day because they couldn't get any more hourly wages because they were forced to go home due to curfew. Nobody was talking about those things. Nobody was talking about how DC residents literally came in and cleaned up the streets and picked up all of these white hate spew signs and literally saved democracy on that day. Nobody was talking about those things in the news. And that's where the frustration comes about true racial equity and racial justice, is that we're only called upon when we're needed. And we were needed in this election, and post-election, we're still bearing the brunt of what it means to be Black in America. And that's that's everyday frustration. I'm sure you feel those same frustrations being Black yourself.
Literally, retweet. And I think when we come into this conversation, something that even in the creation of this project that we really had to handle with a nuanced hand was the inexplicable interlap between law enforcement in America and racial injustice. Mm-hmm. And I think, the question of double standard, I think is no question now that we're in this conversation. Yes, there's a double standard. And what are the consequences in the root problems of this double standard that are leading us to solutions? And I think a consequence that you just highlighted was these things happen and we all suffer, but Black people especially suffer greatly because there's the trauma of centuries of injustice that are attached to it. It's like there was a noose erected in the heart of our nation's capital. There are white supremacist groups that are known doing these things. And then we see a lackluster response to it. And not only do we deal with that in itself, but then you add the backlash of, but when my friends were downtown, they were getting arrested, they were getting citations, and they definitely didn't break open the windows and doors of the state capitol. They were met with over police militarization, SWAT, tanks, honestly, things that we as a country think are so foreign to us, but it's happening right in our nation's capital. But then when you flip it on its head, it's like, okay, people breaking into the Capitol building, threatening congresswomen, congressmen, literally harming people, killing people, beating somebody to death, causing mental trauma that later led to even more deaths, unfortunately, from suicide. And the reaction just seems so inequitable. And I don't think I know is just entirely out of line and so out of pocket. Like the pocket's gone, it's disintegrated. That's how out of pocket it is.
It literally is like we're talking about like policing in America. You can't ever move forward in history without acknowledging the stain that a particular body and structure has put on our history, right? It's like saying, your house is on fire, but we aren't going to call the firefighters to come put the fire out. Then what are we talking about? Like you're just going to let me burn down? So, and that's a part of what we're failing to have in these conversations around policing is that the fire itself is the police, and we're failing as a country to put the fire out, and that we're failing to recognize this country's past and history of Black communities and policing. I work closely with an organization called Black History, Culture, and Police, and there's two professors from who are in DC who train police officers across the nation on Black history, culture, and show them what policing looked like during the slave trade, what policing looked like in the early 1900s when they were used to capture Black people, in the early 1800s when they were used to capture Black people and bring them back to slave owners. When being a police officer was a mask in the 1900s for being a member of the KKK. And when you confront those folks with their history and their past, then we can have a conversation about how do we break down the structure and the systemic barriers that we're seeing in our country and move forward and make that change. So we can't ever put out the fire until the firefighters come. And I think that's a part of the problem. One of the things that I always, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but one of my mentors taught me this thing, like when we go out and we point fingers at people, we're pointing three fingers back at ourselves, right? And that's a part of the accountability, right? We can't just go out and point fingers and say, you did something wrong, it's time for me to penalize you for that, or I'm holding you accountable to vote for this, because again, like you're pointing three fingers back at yourself. So there's some accountability that I have to have as a person as well. So in addition to me going out to protest, I also need to go out and vote, and I also need to go out and hold our officials that we elect accountable to say, I've been protesting all summer for this fight, and you still haven't made noise or made movement on it. So my vote is going to reflect that, but also even after my vote, I'm going to hold you accountable for that, right? I'm going to follow up with you multiple times to say, hey, and it's tough. I hate to say that, but it's an unfortunate reality. But it's also, I hate the fact that that's a part of the structure, and that's part of like the structure that we need to break down in American democracy, but also around all these issues that we're talking about.
Right. You said some really great things. I just want to start pulling them out a little bit. So that program you mentioned with the 2 professors, that was really impactful to me, because something that's really big about this whole series we're doing, everybody, is that we're looking for solutions. And a big, strong foundation we have for our solutions as a group, as a steering committee that's presenting this, is it requires action. Just like you said, it requires more than, it's kind of like, what do you do past the demonstration? Because a demonstration, as necessary as it is, as important as it is, as vital as it is in our American culture and what we've seen, it does not change. It can change laws, but it takes footsteps, and it takes people willing to take those footsteps after the demonstration to do so. It's something that I experienced, especially when all of this started happening, especially when we saw the killing of George Floyd. And I know we're focusing on Capitol riots, so I'll stay there too.
Yeah.
But something that I always experience with our other counterparts, other Gen Zers, other millennials, is kind of like this sense of helplessness,
right?
That honestly gets, drilled into why you see such a huge following and such a huge participation in protests, because they literally have no other avenues that they're aware of as far as what can they do. And you just see like people throwing their money at it, and then of course throwing like a day or 2 at it as far as I'm gonna go out and march, but nothing really else.
Yeah.
And I think we need to start creating a sense of fulfillment that goes beyond just a event.
Yeah.
Or
spot on.
PayPal transaction,
Right. Exactly. Or a retweet.
Or a retweet, or a repost, or a black screen, and not knocking any of that. Please do not think I'm knocking any of that, anybody that's watching this. But when you start connecting the dots, it's like, can you show, using a high level word, fecundity, or can you just show the reach? Where's the range of these activities?
It's slacktivism, and it's partly like, how do we go?
Slacktivism?
It's slacktivism. It's lazy activism.
That's my new favorite word.
It's like you can do one thing, but I don't necessarily have to do the other. That's not how activism works. But it's also like we have to move away from, it's like performative versus normative. We have to move away from the performative actions, the performative things that makes us look good. And we have to move away from the statements and I'm standing in solidarity, or I'm sending my sorrow. That's all performative measures that are shiny and sweet. But until I see normative measures where we're not making it a statement, but we're making it the practice, we're making it instilled into the system, and breaking down the systems and building it back better. That's the piece that we need to focus on, not the performative piece, but the normative piece. But you say you're going on topic from the Capitol riots, but this is all with the Capitol riots was just the icing on the cake. It literally was an opportunity that exposed. It opened Pandora's box, because the genie has been in the bottle and now it's out. Right? Is that the Congress members that we see that still went on that day and said no to the election, the Congresswomen that went outside and waved their hands and said, "Thank you for doing this. Thank you for your work." Those were the folks that that riot amplified their voices to the point where it showed their true racisms and showed their hidden agenda. And we're seeing that reflected in our Congress right now, that folks would rather disenfranchise and suppress Black voters here in Washington, D.C., but also across the country, and be okay with that, other than addressing the stain on this country's past, right? And it's not new. We've been seeing this for years in our country and represented in our government. And the problem is, right now, the urgency of now in this moment is that When I say point finger and three fingers back, is that we need to be the ones running for office. We need to be the ones taking the realms. We need to be the ones holding people accountable. Because as hard as it seems, and as many times they say the squeaky wheel gets the oil, I'm going to speak and fight and keep talking like hell as much as I have to until Martin Luther King said, until freedom has come. Because again, if that's truly who we are and that's truly what we want, then we got to keep fighting on for it, and breaking down the system and changing public safety and reimagine that and what that looks like. We got to keep doing it. I'm currently leading a task force, facilitating a task force in the city of Tacoma Park, where they're reimagining public safety. And there's a task force of 15 people, community people. And the one thing that I always emphasize in our task force meetings, and as I'm leading those groups and those meetings, is that this process isn't about me. It's about how you all can make a community-driven process that is reflective of the community, right? And it's like, we can't talk about just policing. We also have to talk about mental health. We also have to talk about opportunity gaps. We also have to talk about education, the lack of education in Black neighborhoods. We also have to talk about economic justice, racial justice. Like, all of those things are layers to the whole problem. And if we aren't addressing those things, then we aren't reaching to true equity, or we aren't giving people the opportunity and quality of life that they deserve.
Facts. And I think, because you're right, it all leads into it. And what I'm hearing, and I just want to bring it back to, because we're so solutions-based, one of our solutions to this response, or lack of response, insufficient response, incompetent response that we've seen from the Capitol Police and law enforcement at the Capitol riots, is we need to create more community accountability, and we need to empower our communities to be able to protect our communities, because unfortunately, it's kind of like, we got to be real about what we're dealing with. And like you said, there's so much that has to be unrooted from law enforcement in America, as far as racial bias, all the way down to, and it's a bottom up, top down, bottom up type of thing, right? Because you have Capitol officers who are taking selfies. I mean, going back to the timeline, January 11th, we have Capitol officers who are being suspended, one for taking a selfie, one for putting on a hat and directing people around the Capitol, and 10 to 15 other people under investigation. And then you have, at that level, this is like boots on the ground level. At a higher level, you have this unconscious, or I don't even like to call it unconscious bias. You have this racist sentiment that says, oh yeah, we're getting these reports from the FBI. Yeah, we're hearing this, we're hearing that. But yeah, I don't think it's a big issue. We don't need anybody's help. And you have the sergeant saying that, the same sergeant that retires or, resigns the day after everything cuts loose. And some people can, but I can't look at that and not say, yeah, it doesn't matter how good your system is. When you have humans and you have human error and you have human hate at the head, the helm, and the bottom of a situation, you're going to get what you saw. And you're going to see the enablement of white supremacy, and you're going to see unfair and inequitable reactions from law enforcement until you address the problem, which is unrooting white supremacy in law enforcement. And I think for decades, we as a people, and especially Gen Zers, I feel like Gen Zers are like the definition of I am confusion when it comes to some of the things we see happen perpetually again and again, because we're fixers. We're like, stop doing that. And when we see something happen time and time again, and then, it launches a new investigation, it launches a new conversation, and we're like, it's the same answer. It's white supremacy, it's racism, it's inequity. It's the same thing. So when are we going to stop circling the problem and actually just unroot it? Like, when are we going to start taking actionable steps to holding somebody accountable and saying, hey, yeah, you can't be a public servant if you hate half of the public. Exactly. Or in DC, a majority, is DC still majority Black?
A plurality. 48%, which is the highest percentage. amongst all races. So it's plurality, but it's majority Black and brown.
Yeah. But yeah, you can't be a public civil servant in a city where you hate majority of the population. Yeah, and exactly. The fact that as a society, we haven't gotten to that, it's not about, I think with implicit bias, and I said this in our conversation with our Black officers, but it's like when people hear implicit bias, you kind of make the connection anti-racist, and it's really not. Like that program you described, that's not necessarily implicit bias training. That's like next level. We're going to take the mask off of the bad guy and just say what it is. Y'all need training about historical practices in this country that lead communities to not trusting you and that lead to you not honestly being the best fit for certain communities.
Yep.
And
that's spot on. That's spot on. I mean, you're so right with that implicit bias piece, because we all have implicit biases, right? Like,
right.
I like Chick-fil-A over the Popeye sandwich. Like, that's an implicit bias.
That's fact. Somebody's gonna be upset about this, but that's
like somebody is. But it's like, we can talk about what you like the surface level, but if we aren't getting to the, like you said, the root, then we aren't addressing the true problem, right? The thing is, like, the thing about what January 6th has like showed so many people, and what I appreciate about January 6th is the urgency and the rage of what it calls for people to actually say, I'm ready to get out and fight. Like, I'm tired of seeing this. I want to reach equity. I want to be an actor on racial justice. Like, I need to get out and act. And like, it invigorated so many young people, elder people, people from all backgrounds and walks of life to come out and literally say, call it what it was, but also say, I'm ready to fight for this issue. And that's what we need. I went, you're on Clubhouse. I was on Clubhouse and I was in a conversation called Youth Conservatism. How can we revive it? And it was about how do we revive the conservative party as young conservatives. I'm going to explain myself and why I was in that room.
I wasn't going to judge you, but somebody else is about to judge you.
There was somebody who I went to college with. He was in the room, and it was weird to me while he was in the room. So I was like, let me join, I guess. And I joined, and it was all like, probably like 2 Black people, and me being the 3rd Black one. But it was like hundreds of like white people, right? And the problem, and I said, I'm gonna stay in this conversation. I'm a true Democrat. I'm a progressive. So I'm gonna stay in this conversation because I think one of the things that we're failing to do as a country is have the conversation and hear the other side. Because for far too long, we let political parties dictate the fate of democracy. We let political parties dictate people's livelihoods, that it has failed us over the years. So I stayed in the conversation. They were like, oh, a Black guy's in here. Let me promote him as a panelist. So they messed up by doing that. They promoted me as a panelist. And I came on and I was like, I'm going to piss all of you all off, but I'm letting you know right now, I'm not a conservative. I'm a Democrat, and I'm actually a progressive Democrat at that. And and I felt a pause. Like everyone, mics went mute. And I was like, well, I'm going to continue. So some of the things that I heard in this conversation, it's not about the fact that you love your party. It's the fact that you ignore people on the other side to the point where you're willing to risk their livelihoods to reach whatever agenda you have, because that's the political agenda that your party has set. And I said, Democrats have a problem too. But again, like, we have to start putting people over party. And I explained, I said, let me go a bit deeper here. And what I mean by that is that, for example, a lot of you all said in this conversation that the Affordable Care Act was the worst thing ever this government has done. It was a terrible idea. We shouldn't have ever done it. And it was stupid. They said Barack Obama didn't know what he was doing. It was dog whistles. And I came on, I said, I heard you all say that, but let me tell you why the Affordable Care Act, from a people standpoint, why it was important to people like myself and my mom who didn't have health insurance. It was people like my mother who didn't have health insurance And then I said, this isn't a party thing. My mom did not have health insurance. And the fact that the Affordable Care Act gave her a basic opportunity and her family to walk into an emergency room and get basic treatment for any health issue, health cause, or any emergency reason, like that was a stepping stone for American families, not Democratic families, but for American families. Like your moms were able to walk into a hospital. Rural people in rural America, they were able to walk into a hospital now and get treatment, something that wasn't happening before. So like, that's not a party issue. That's like helping American families issue. So the more we can get to a point where we're not debating about things because of the person who presented the idea, because in their party affiliation, the better we can move forward as a country, because we aren't going to move forward if we're going to just keep letting political parties dictate out the will of the people.
I feel that before I, respond.
And push back if I'm wrong on that.
I mean, it's not even that. It just really inspired a train of thought that just brought me back to kind of law enforcement. But before I even go there, I just wanted to say your mom, because you said your mom. I was just like, I'm childish, and that's really funny for me. But I think, and one of the things with this conversation is like, we know you're very involved in politics and you're a progressive young Black Democrat, so we give you that. But for me, I'm not very invested. I'm not invested in politics, but I see how politics have been problematic across the board, and how certain things that shouldn't be political have become very political, such as law enforcement. But something that you said, like people over party and being willing to have a conversation, I think another problem and another solution that I'm inviting law enforcement to be a part of is breaking down the culture of silence and joining the conversation. I mean, being really honest, this conversation ended up being focused on the Gen Z voice just because the probability and the likelihood of getting somebody who's in law enforcement to be a part of this conversation, talking about the Capitol riots on January 6th and law enforcement response was very low.
Yep.
And it just gets to a point where I feel like, especially us as Gen Zers, and we have another episode where it's like us versus them, but it starts feeling very us versus them when we have a situation where, because of that party line, which is, okay, I'm law enforcement.
Exactly.
And you start building that barrier around you, and it gets real quiet and it gets real silent. And people, it's like, come on, we're talking about people. We're talking about the fact that people are hurt, people are traumatized, people got killed. We're talking about, nooses in the Capitol. We're talking about something that impacted us on a people level. Because if it didn't impact people, nobody would be talking about it. Nobody would care. If it was just some political thing, it was just like, whatever, we'd be like, okay, it's whatever. But people are hurt. And it feels like in these conversations or the lack of conversation with law enforcement, it always comes with this side thing of just like, okay, they're just not seeing us as people because they have the badge and we don't. And I've heard from law enforcement, and I understand from law enforcement wanting to feel humanized. But then I have the critique of what does kind of dehumanize you is when you don't want to talk to people about things.
Exactly. That was spot on.
Yeah, like it's intense.
It's like automatically when someone say defund the police, they're like, oh, I don't want to have a conversation with you. When really, like, I can be saying defund the police, but I may mean, and I'm just speaking hypothetically here, I may mean like, let's put some of the money that's going to policing into mental health, or let's put some of that money into employment services and give people opportunity. And like that's the problem. It's like,
or it's like with the public, if somebody says defund the police, maybe they're coming from the aspect of seeing the police over militarized with the tank, and they're like, how much does that tank cost? And it takes a law enforcement specialist, somebody who can explain like, okay, maybe that was a government surplus, or okay, when you say defund the police, what we really need to do is put more funding into training, because there's no funding for training because this is the limited budget. Like, but you don't have a chance to say that or present that if you don't show up to the conversation. It's the same way you don't get to talk about healthcare if you don't show up to the conversation about healthcare.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about like when you don't show up, what does that say and what are the consequences of not showing up? So a solution is show up and be transparent, and not even being transparent, because I understand yes, be transparent, but don't be afraid to not have all of the answers when you walk into a conversation, because that shows that you're human. When you don't have the textbook, like, code response, and you get to just honestly say like, hey, this is my perspective from my experiences as a law enforcement agent and what I felt and XYZ and the other. If it's not perfect, I can't even knock you, because that's human and humans aren't perfect. Mm-hmm. But when it comes down to like, nope, I can't. And it's like the wall goes up, and it's just like, well, whatever you say next, I'm not gonna, because right. How long did it take you to just be human and respond to this human conversation? Before we run out of time though, I do want to get into one of the really great parts about having you on, because with talking about solutions, you're working on such an innovative solution to what happened in law enforcement response on January 6th. And it's something that I would have never thought of until like I met you and I read about what you were doing. So I'm just going to read a little bit more of the timeline, and then I'm going to let you talk about 51 for 51 type stuff,
Awesome.
So on Tuesday, January 5th, this is the day before the Capitol riot, we have Mayor Bowser requesting and receiving a limited force from the DC National Guard with a number of like 340 people, but they were unarmed and they were just there to do traffic flow, not law enforcement. That was going to get handled by DC police. Day of, and this is going to be like a minute by minute, 1:34 p.m., Mayor Bowser asking the Army Secretary for additional guard forces, according to the Pentagon timeline. 3 p.m., they're determining that all available forces for the DC National Guard are required to reestablish security for the Capitol complex. 6:14, they establish a perimeter on the west side of the Capitol. 8 p.m., the Capitol is declared secure. So 1:34 p.m., the mayor of DC is like, we need help. They didn't decide to really enact that until an hour and a half later, 3 p.m., and then finally, everything's secured. Members of Congress returned to complete the opening of the Electoral College vote by 8 p.m. Yep. Can you kind of give some context for that?
Yeah.
On maybe 6-hour gap in what you're working for and what your organization is pushing for DC?
Yeah, and for many, that was a huge day for the morning for DC statehood, because we felt more closer now than in that time more than ever from electing 2 new senators. But it was also, we saw the inequities of what it means to not be a state. And everybody was like, well, call the National Guard in. The mayor has the authority to do that. And really, she doesn't, because we aren't a state. Though she has the power of a governor, she doesn't have the opportunity to call in her own state's National Guard, set the authority of the president, which is like many things in Washington, D.C. So like that moment at 1:30, like you mentioned, the mayor could have called in the National Guard herself if we were a state to really save democracy. But however, our local law enforcement stepped up and really went in to really help save democracy. But again, it's not even just like about like statehood and what we're fighting for. It's not even just about National Guard and being able to call in National Guard when we want to, though we should be able to do that, and it shouldn't be at the authority of the president. Think about all of the local laws that we pass on stricter gun control, on women's rights to choose and reproductive rights, on healthcare. Many of those laws have been overturned by Congress because Congress has the ability to overturn local DC laws. So, which means a senator from Florida, a congresswoman from Wyoming has the opportunity to overturn a DC law if they want to. It sucks, but it's the tyranny that we live in. And that's what we're fighting for 51 for 51 is that we believe that if the Mitch McConnell can affirm the rights for 3 Supreme Court justices, then we should be able to affirm the rights for American citizens to have full rights to their citizenship. And that means making DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. So we should be able to bypass the filibuster, an arcane tool that has been used in the Senate to block progressive reform for years. Filibuster has been used to try to block 200 anti-lynching bills, to try to block the Civil Rights Act of 1965, to overturn the Dreams Act and many other things that have really helped us achieve true equality for this country. And make no mistake, it would be an attempt to try to use it to block DC statehood, enfranchising Black residents to their right to vote and representation. DC statehood isn't a partisan issue. It's an American issue. It's an American fight, and that's what we got to make it. If we so-called are the land of the free and the home of the brave, then if we so-called live up to the true creed of this Constitution that all people are created equal, we'll live up to the fact that DC should be the 51st state, and that's what we're fighting for.
Wow. Well, thank you for fighting that fight, and we just have it here. We have innovative solutions that come from real problems that need to be seriously addressed. And I think the whole purpose of this Next Gen talk is talking about how me, you, the person that's watching this, and everybody else involved takes up this, and we go from slacktivism back to activism. Yes, that's my new favorite word. Absolutely my new favorite word. But I just want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your story, sharing your pain, sharing your intelligence and your insight, and helping us build a safer public for everybody involved.
Thank you. And thank you for your work, your advocacy, your activism. It takes a village to really move forward on the things that we care about and fighting for. And we don't just care about these things because we want to. Part of it is because we have to, but also a huge part of it is because we're tired. Like we're tired of seeing these things break down our communities, right? And that's what this fight is about: is building our communities to really have opportunity and reach that quality of life that we deserve. So, Maya, truly thank you for your activism and the work that you do all across America and within our communities.
Oh, you're welcome. Vice versa. We're here. Thanks, Jamal. So that has been our episode, Double Standard, Next Gen's take on law enforcement response to the Capitol riots. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.